Today we will be solving the equation 337 divided by 4. Let's start with an estimation. Prior to making our estimation, we should change our dividend, 337, to a friendlier number such as 300. Now we will solve for 300 divided by 4, giving us a quotient of 75. Because we lowered our dividend for our estimation, we should expect our final quotient to be larger than 75. Let's start by using base 10 blocks to help us solve this equation. First, we must ensure we understand the place values of our quotient so we can represent the number with our base 10 blocks. The first 3 is in the hundreds position, representing 300. This means we will have 3 flats. The next 3 is in the tens position, representing 30. This means we will have 3 rods. Lastly, the 7 is in the ones position, representing 7. This means we will have 7 ones. Our goal is to divide all of our base 10 blocks that make up our quotient into 4 equal groups. To do this, we will use the 4 boxes below. We will start with the 3 in the hundreds place value and make our way down to the 7 in our ones place value. As we can see, we only have 3 flats, therefore we cannot split them equally between our 4 groups. Let's trade them for rods instead. Because 10 rods make up 1 flat, this means we will receive 30 rods since we traded 3 flats. Let's divide our rods into our 4 equal groups. Now our rods have been divided equally into 4 groups. This left us with 8 rods per group, or in other words, 80 in each group. However, we still have 1 rod left over. Let's trade our leftover rod for ones instead. We know that 10 ones make up 1 rod. This means that we will end up with 10 ones since we are only trading 1 rod. Now we have 17 ones. Let's distribute them equally between our 4 groups. This left us with 4 ones in each group. However, we still have 1 remaining one that did not fit into our groups. We will come back to that. In order to find our answers, we will count up the base 10 blocks in just one of our squares. Because they are equal, it does not matter what group you count. Let's start by counting our rods. There are 8 rods which represent the number 80. There are 4 ones which represent the number 4. Then we must add our rods and ones together for a sum of 84. We can't forget our leftover 1. Any base 10 blocks that don't fit into our groups equally are referred to as a remainder. We have a leftover 1, therefore a remainder of 1. This makes our final quotient of the equation 337 divided by 4, 84, remainder 1. We will now move on to our pictorial strategy. This strategy is very similar as the concrete stage with our base 10 blocks. However, students can now solve using the strategy without needing physical manipulatives. The square represents our flat, the line represents a rod, and lastly, the circle represents our ones. We must start by demonstrating our dividend. The representation of 337 looks as follows. We will follow the exact same steps as we did in the concrete stage. Since we only have 3 flats and cannot distribute them equally in the 4 circles below, let's trade them for rods. Since we traded 3 flats, each worth 100, we now have 30 rods worth 10. We did not lose or gain, we still have a total of 337, just in a different form. Let's divide our rods equally between the 4 groups below. Now our rods have been divided equally and we have 1 rod left over. Let's trade the rod for 10 ones. Now we have a total of 17 ones. Using mental math, we can determine that 16 divided by 4 would equal 4. Since our dividend is 17, we should have about 4 ones in each group. Look at that, we did end up with 4 ones in each group. We also have a remainder of 1. Let's count up the rods and ones in one of the circles below to determine our final answer. We have 8 rods, which is equal to 80. Then we must add our ones. We have 4 ones. 80 plus 4 leaves us with a sum of 84. But we can't forget about our remainder. Once we include the remainder, our final quotient is 84, remainder 1. Now we will solve 337 divided by 4 symbolically. Start by setting up our equation as follows. Our place values will be important when solving this equation. We will start in the hundreds and work our way down to the ones. We are looking for a number that we can multiply with our divisor. Since we are starting in the hundreds place value, our multiplicand must have the same number of place values. In other words, a 3-digit number. The product of these numbers must be less than 337. Let's try the number 100 since this is the lowest 3-digit number that we can use. The product of 4 and 100 is 400. Because this is not lower than 337, this will not work. This was a similar problem we had when we used flats in our previous strategies. Let's move on to the tens like we did prior. Now we must find a 2-digit number that multiplied with 4 gives us a product lower than 337. Similar to our base 10 blocks, we are now at the steps where we had to distribute our rods. We cannot use, for example, 82, because now we are including our ones place value. Let's try 80. 80 multiplied by 4 gives us a product of 320. Let's subtract 320 from 337 and find the difference. This left us with a difference of 17. Let's move our multiplicand down below and remember it for later. Now we can move on to our ones. Now we need a 1-digit number that provides us with a product of less than 17 when multiplied by 4. Let's try 4. This leaves us with a product of 16. Now we will repeat the previous steps and find the difference of 17 subtract 16. This left us with a difference of 1. Since we can't multiply 4 by any number to get a product lower than 1 besides 0, we know we have a remainder of 1. Let's move our 4 to the box below. We must add 80, which was in our tens place value, and 4, which was in our ones place value. This leaves us with a sum of 84, but we can't forget our remainder. Our final quotient is 84, remainder 1. Now our last strategy. For this strategy, it is important to remember that multiplication and division are inverse operations. We will use multiplication to find our final quotient. As we can see below, if we knew the multiplier in this equation, we would know the quotient of our division equation. Since we don't, let's break it down. In this strategy, our multiplicand will always be 4 since it is the divisor in our division equation. The product of our multiplicand and multiplier must be less than 337. Let's try 4 times 60. That leaves us with a product of 240. Now we must subtract our product of 240 from 337. This leaves us with a difference of 97. Now let's find an equation that when multiplied by 4 provides us with a product of less than 97. 4 times 20 leaves us with a product of 80. Now we will repeat the same steps. 97 subtract 80 leaves us with a difference of 17. The next equation must have a product of less than or equal to 17. 4 times 4 equals 16. 17 subtract 16 leaves us with a difference of 1. We can no longer continue these equations because the only multiplier that will provide us with a product of less than 1 is 0. This means we have a remainder of 1. Now we can move on to our next step. Now we must add all of our multipliers. The sum of these numbers, including any remainders, is our final quotient. 60 plus 20 plus 4 leaves us with a sum of 84. We can't forget to include our remainder. This leaves us with a final quotient of 84, remainder 1. To wrap up, let's compare our estimation to our final quotient. As mentioned during our estimation, we lowered our dividend to 300, which means our final quotient should be larger than our estimation of 75. Our final quotient is 84, remainder 1. This is a larger number than 75, and it's less than 10 digits away. This was a good estimation.